David Latzko is an associate professor of economics at Penn State York, and his primary research interests are Pennsylvania and local economic history. So let's give David a round of applause and welcome him to the podium here.
Good, everybody. So sewing machines. Sewing machines are kind of interesting, partly for sort of local history reasons, because at the very beginning of the sewing machine industry in this country, there was a manufacturer here located here in New York. And there's a bit of a mystery involved with that manufacturer. Also, the sale of sewing machines in New York has a very long history as well. There was a significant downtown presence for sewing machine sellers. But sewing machines are also kind of interesting from a social history perspective, because the sewing machine was the very first, great consumer saving or time-saving consumer appliance of the 19th century. You go back a couple of hundred years, and you couldn't just walk into a store and buy ready-to-made clothing off the rack. Instead, households had to sew their own clothes, and that was women's work. Along with cooking, sewing was one of the most time-consuming household chores for women, because women sewed not only their family's clothing, but they also hand-sewed their family's clothes, coats, caps, formal clothing, household linens, and so on. So sewing was a very time-consuming chore for women in the 1800s. Excuse me. The sewing machine changed all that. Sewing machine was a great time saver. In fact, the writer, Francis Miller, who was a writer, speaker, early documentary filmmaker, actually, in referring to the sewing machine, said that no invention has done so much to deliver woman from drudgery. No one piece of machinery has done so much to deliver her from her burdens, her seclusion, her serfdom. Singer sewing machines in the late 1800s, one of their big sales pitches was the time-saving nature of sewing machines. It freed up mothers to have more time to spend properly raising their children, was one of their advertising points. So sewing machines important from a social history perspective. Elias Howe is generally credited with inventing the sewing machine. He wasn't the first to patent a sewing machine, but he was the first to patent really something that looks like today's sewing machines. In 1846, Howe patented the first sewing machine using both a lock stitch and the eye-pointed needle. Here's a picture of his sewing machine. Unfortunately, Howe's machine, his patent, didn't cover all of the parts that were necessary to make a really functional home sewing machine. Several companies also had competing patents, and in the early 1850s, there was a lot of litigation between these companies over who really invented the sewing machine. So to put an end to that legal dispute, in 1856, the sewing machine combination was formed. Elias Howe, Wheeler Wilson and Company, I.M. Singer and Company, and Grove and Baker, they pooled their 9 patents that covered all of the basic elements of a functioning sewing machine. And they agreed to sell licenses to produce sewing machines using their patents. So they charged sewing machine makers a fee of $15 per machine. Howe insisted that at least 24 manufacturers were to be licensed. The last of the patents did expire in 1877, and the combination fell apart. So these 4 companies, they were still competitors. They only cooperated to make sure that there was some sort of sewing machine industry in this country by pooling their patents and licensing people's ability to produce sewing machines. But otherwise, they competed with one another. And so with the formation of the sewing machine combination, sewing machine production in this country took off. The 1860 Census of Manufacturers records 74 sewing machine establishments in the United States. Altogether, these employed 2,287 workers. They used about $1.4 million of capital, think machinery. And in 1860, they produced a total of 111,623 sewing machines. And these had a value of over $4 million. One of these 74 sewing machine manufacturers was located here in York, Pennsylvania. Here's a scan I made from the 1860 Census of Manufacturers manuscript schedules. The Pennsylvania State Library up in Harrisburg has these on microfilm. And here's one of the entries for York. And here's where the kind of mystery starts. You can clearly read the sewing machines over there. And, you know, I'm old, so I learned cursive back in elementary school. And I think I can read the last name as Moore. But the first two letters to me look like WG or maybe HG. But there was some sort of sewing machine manufacturer in the city of York in 1860. This establishment was located in the second Census Division of York borough. According to the Census Bureau, the second Census Division of York was the area south of Main Street, which I take to mean market. Anyways, this establishment had $500 in capital invested, which consisted of 2 turning lathes to machine the parts, had 2 employees who got an average monthly wage of $70. The company used up 2,400 pounds of iron castings, costing them $190, $150 of other articles. And they used all those inputs to produce 300 sewing machines during the, I guess, fiscal year ending June 1st, 1860. So in the early days of the sewing machine industry in this country, there was a producer here in York. But who was this? Who was this W.G. Moore? Well, that's kind of the mystery here. Because if you turn to the population schedules for York, the handwritten census population schedules, there's no Moore, nobody with the last name Moore recorded as living in the second Census Division of York in 1860. So no Moores at all south of Main Street. North of Main Street in the first census division, there was nobody with the last name of Moore with the first name beginning with either W or H, which is what, to me, that first letter looks like. There were some Moores in the county with the first name beginning with a W or an H. There was a William Moore who was a servant over in Spring Garden Township. A Wendell Moore who was a laborer in Spring Garden Township. There were some other W. Moores in the county. One was a forgeman down in Lower Chanceford Township. You had a Slater over in Peach Bottom, railroad agent out in Wrightsville. There was an H. Moore, somebody with the first name beginning with H, living in Fairview Township. They were a carpenter. So nobody can't figure out who this W or H. Moore was. The York County History Center's library, just over that way, has a bunch of York City business directories. And in the 1856 business directory, there's nobody with the name Moore listed. And if you look at later directories, nobody with the initials W.G. Moore is listed in any of them. But there is outside evidence besides the census that there might have been a Moore sewing machine company here, because there's a compilation of 19th century sewing machine manufacturers, and they do list a Moore sewing machine company. And the earliest record is circa 1860, which is about the right time frame because we're dealing with the 1860 census. but they don't have any other information about the firm, no city, no state where they were located. Moore wasn't in business very long, apparently, because no sewing machine maker is listed in the 1863-1864 York City directory. And by the 1870 census of manufacturers, there's no record of any kind of sewing machine manufacturing going on in York County. So for a brief period of time, there was a company in this city producing sewing machines, owned by somebody probably named Moore, but who that was, don't know. Any more information? There might be a second link to sewing machine manufacturing here, though, in New York, and that's Isaac Singer, founder of the Singer Sewing Machine Company. Among many things, he was a mechanic and a tinkerer, and in 1851, he patented an improved sewing machine. His main claim to fame, though, was on the marketing side of sewing machines. In fact, his company pioneered the hire purchase system, where you buy the machine on credit. There might be some York County links for Isaac Singer. Prowell's History of York County asserts that Singer worked as a tailor here in York in the 1830s, and he married, and I put married there in quotes because Singer had a wife and family in New York that he'd abandoned to become an actor down in Baltimore. But he married a local girl, Mary Ann Sponsler. None of the biographies of Singer say anything at all about him in York. But there's a possibility here, because for a time, Singer was a member of a traveling group of actors called the Baltimore Strolling Players. And it's probably likely that that group came up here and gave performances. But the biographies of Singer do state that he met Sponsler in Baltimore and that Sponsler's family operated an oyster canning business. But there's a clipping in one of the files over in the library in the 1890s. Little notice that one of their sons, John Albert Singer, lived on East Market Street here in York in the 1890s. And clipping in the paper was because he left his wife to go to New York. So maybe like father, like son. So there probably is some potential connection here between Singer family and York, whether Singer was a tailor here in the 1830s, don't know. So there is a history here of producing sewing machines in New York. Short history, but there's a much longer history of sales of sewing machines in York. After the Civil War, the economy started to boom, and so people started to purchase sewing machines. And in the 1868-1869 directory, a number of sewing machine manufacturers had representatives here in New York. Grove and Baker, who was one of the 4 members of the sewing machine combination. Actually, they were sort of the junior partner in that their patent was the least important, but they were included in the combination because the president of Grove and Baker came up with the whole idea of the sewing machine combination. But they were represented by F.A. Stride on 100 South George Street, the Howe Machine Company, which was actually run by Elias Howe's brother. They were located at 137 West Market. Here's their little notice, their advert in the city directory. They were on the corner of Market and Water Street, so 137 West Market. But you had C.F. Kurtz at 11 North George Street, Strayer at 227 West Market, Hiram Young at 10 East Market. By the 1870s, all of the major sewing machine manufacturers had sales representatives here in York. Singer was represented by Wood and Ivory at 18 North George Street. Wheeler and Wilson, which was actually in the 1870s still the leading producer of family sewing machines for the household. They were at 115 East Market. So house sewing machines at 20. You could buy domestic sewing machines at the northwest corner of Center Square. And Wheeler Wilson, in the 1870s, they were still the leading manufacturer of sewing machines. And their best-selling model was the number 8, declared by the highest authorities the best sewing machine apparatus in the world. So you could call it 22 North George and examine it before purchasing. Here's a picture I found of a Wheeler and Wilson number 8. See the prominent number 8 on there. Also in the 1870s, still Grove and Baker, 123 West Market, Wood sewing machines, Wilson sewing machines, both on Market, Florence sewing machines on West Philadelphia. It was in the 1870s that a big name in the sales of sewing machines in York comes into the record. Well, here's a Grove and Baker machine from the 70s on the left, a Florence sewing machine on the right. Remember, jump back here. Don't know if they're related, but there was an L. Strayer in the 1868, 1869 directory selling sewing machines at 227 West Market by the 1877 city directory. There was another Strayer, W.S. Strayer, selling all brands of sewing machines, one door west of the post office. So Howe, Singer, domestic and so. So, and nice cabinet there as well. But the big name that started in the 1870s was Eli Grove. Eli Grove was born in 1853 in Hopewell Township. He came to York in 1870 and he began working as an agent for the Howe Machine Company. He eventually became the agent for Singer sewing machines for both York and Adams County in 1877. And here's his ad in the 1886 city directory. Talks about the bottom paragraph. The office where this machine is sold is 2 doors below the courthouse, York, PA, and is managed by E.F. Grove, all caps, who has controlled the sewing machine trade in York and Adams counties for the last 9 years. His sales run over 7,000 machines. So he's selling almost 800 sewing machines a year here in York. He was very successful and eventually was appointed the manager of Singer's Southern Pennsylvania district, 1892. He lived at 137 West Market Street, and that home is now owned by the York County Bar Association. Couldn't find a good picture of it. But he died in 1935. But he's important because he operated the Singer sewing machine store, which was a long-time downtown fixture here in York. His ad. People go to E.F. Grove, number 4 East Market Street. So it was located right off the center square. And here's a scan from an 1894 Sanborn fire insurance map. I don't know if you're familiar with these, but the Library of Congress has scans of fire insurance maps of all kinds of towns. For here in York County, I've looked at ones for Red Line and Dallastown as well. But they were made for a fire insurance company, and they just show basically who was where at certain times. So here's the 1894 Sanborn fire insurance map, area there by Center Square. Number 4 were the Singer sewing machine. I don't know what would be worth. Well, for the people here, I can try to pull it. Right about there. So just off Center Square, near the Hotel York, Florida Hotel on the other corner. At the Singer store, you could go in, you could try out sewing machines. In the early days, they had women there actually demonstrating their use. That was Singer's gimmick, the marketing side of things. All the other sewing machine manufacturers, the representatives eventually faded away by the turn of the last century. You can still buy sewing machines besides Singer's at stores, department stores. Here's an ad from the 1921 city directory for Rother. located at 42 South George. And second line from the bottom, they were offering for sale their white sewing machines. The Singer store spent a long time just off Center Square, but they began, as time moved on, to move further away from straight downtown, still remaining on Market Street. But by the late 1960s, the Singer store moved out of York, out to the York Mall. Here's their ad for the 1969 city directory. The York Mall store closed sometime in the early 70s. Couldn't find out exactly when. And that kind of brought a close to the longtime York fixture for almost a century. At the Singer store, where you could go purchase a sewing machine so that your wife could spend much more time with raising her children properly. So, sales pitch. Be happy to try to answer any questions anybody might have, or if anybody has a better idea than I do about what those initials were.
I think that's definitely better. From working with a lot of documents.
That was my initial thought, but not being able to find a name to attach to that with the population schedules made
And
me
you
think.
found somebody in Spring Garden Township, I'm not sure, I have to look it up. But Spring Garden Township at one time ended at Town, which is down, that eventually became Spring, York City line. The Spring Garden Township line was down at where Town started, which was actually down at just a couple blocks down the railroad tracks. And that may have not have been, I'd have to look up when that was annexed, but that actually be close enough doing probably the Wall Street factory that was near.
The Moors in Spring Garden. One was a servant, probably could rule him out.
One was a laborer.
A laborer would be a possibility.
We've talked about, of course, residential usage in Bristol County and going back to industrial use. What was the relationship there with these storefronts? Also have a kind of an industrial division as well.
The storefronts were aimed strictly at the home market. They were, it was a consumer appliance. They wanted, was middle-class women should be hand sewing, basically their pitch. So the store, the companies would have their industrial machines, and they'd have their own separate sales representatives just heading out. But the stores, the Singer store, that was strictly home sales.
Trying to think if you bought a sewing machine, if you were to try to buy a sewing machine today, where would you go? Amazon?
Probably Joann's might have them still. If they're on,
There's a store in Kennett Road that sells Snyder's.
were they on West Market? Were they on West Market?
At one time, the Singer Sewing Machine Company was on West Market.
I
Because I
mean,
used to go there and take sewing lessons with some of my friends. We'd
Yeah.
like the bus in the town on Saturday.
At one point, they moved out to like the 100 block of West Market and like maybe the 200 block. They kept getting further from downtown until they
Yeah.
moved all the way out
It
to.
was just the one thing. West River Street, a few minutes.
I do remember a sewing machine repair spot on West Market, at least sometime in the last 20-some years, because I was in there once asking about getting you a sewing machine cabinet. They were kind of expensive. Say maybe Miller or with Snyder could be right. I don't know if they're still there, but it's certainly for a sewing machine in a long time.
Yeah.
Just a bit of information that most people here know that Samantha Moore was very active in this book was her father repaired sewing machines all over the county at the industrial level. So he was kind of the go-to person who traveled from factory to factory. And that was a pretty good job.
Yeah, the one ad here. Oops. What did I do? The one advertisement. All makes, right down at the bottom, the Strayer ad, all makes of sewing machines repairs. I can imagine that the quality of those kind of very early on. So, and then the Singer ad. Not talking about repairs, but I'm sure you could do there too.
That brings up another question, because with our history, there were there were sewing factories all over York County, including some of the smaller towns, and really big sewing factories. So much clothing was manufactured here, at least in the first half of the 20th century, and back, I think, in the 19th century. So those sewing machines, those commercial sewing machines, were they produced by Singer and these other companies also?
They had divisions that would sell industrial machines, yes. But that's probably an interesting bit of social history as well. Not too familiar with the York County sewing machine or sewing industry, but up in northeastern Pennsylvania, the silk mills came in, and that provided employment for women doing sewing while the men worked in the mines.
Well, we also had several huge silk mills, but then the sewing factories. I think every family knew somebody or had somebody in the family that worked in the sewing factories. And they were all over like Stewartstown, Seven Valley, they were not as quite a few in New York, and they were not small. There's another paper.
Yeah, we'll get to that. My wife's grandmother worked at a sewing machine or sewing factory up in very small town, Sugar Notch, Pennsylvania.
What kind of thing?
It was very kind of, well, like your passing really.
There's a really neat,
An industrial thing.
Yeah.
Recently. But the person we bought our house from worked in the sewing factory. And they were happy to leave it there when we bought the house. It was very heavy.
I don't know, old sewing machines are highly collectible.
there's a, down in Winterstown, there's a museum to the barber arts, and they have all manner of sewing machines there, from the, almost a handheld, to the larger.
I'm not familiar with that.
Yes, it's a teaching museum of barber arts in right outside of Winterstown. And they have a map there of sewing factories in York County. And many of the sewing factories were from York South, probably paralleling or along with rail lines. Glenlock, Shrewsbury, and then of course up there.
It's probably something we don't pay much attention to historically because it was women's work. You're right, probably would. It's an idea for a paper.
So how did you come across this topic and find interest in it?
My colleague Jane Sutton, who might be watching somewhere, she suggested this topic to me because she was doing something with postcards. And she noticed that a lot of the postcards that she was viewing had something to do with selling sewing machines. And she talked to me and sort of coordinated. Her paper is also in the same issue as my sewing machine paper. So that's where I got the idea. So thanks, Jane, if you're watching.
She said I should tell you my story. I always wondered I never got around to asking my mother, how did my grandparents meet? Because my grandmother lived in Allentown.
and my grandfather lived in Abbottstown. So how we get together? Well, it turns out my grandfather, from Abbottstown, for a while, worked as a salesperson for the Singer Sewing Machine Company in Allentown. So my grandma probably married a traveling salesman.
No, I know in the early history of automobile sales, that they would go door to door.
I think
I'm gonna bet that they also went door to door early on with sewing machines.
I have that feeling because there's no record of him owning property in Allentown. But he is listed as an agent for the Singer Sewing Machine. His father had business first, and then George was in it for a while, but not too long, and then he went to York.
More stable, Jim.
You know, there's
The
a,
1890s.
there's a, I believe this is correct, that the Esquire funeral home is Isaac Singer's former residence. And so, you know, and I just noticed he has these markets and stuff there for the singer. But I believe that is the case. It's a formidable looking building.
Oh, the singers were very, very wealthy. For the time. Oh, Isaac Singer he's a character. He enjoyed his life.
I wonder whether his son lived in that house. I didn't know if he had a street number.
No, I don't remember getting the street. There was a clipping in one of the files over in the library about Singer from the newspaper, and it just was really more gossip that he left his wife.
Lila Patrol, our former librarian, a few years ago, she had done a bit of research. They back there in the file somewhere. I'm not sure it's filed in Isaac Singer's file or how it's filed, but you know, do a search in the database and probably come up with it. Because I think it is in the files. But she had old Singer and Stewart family. I think there was an Avalon somewhere. A long time since I looked at it. I'll see if I can find it.
He had a large number of kids with several different women.
It's been better to get divorced sometimes.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Say thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you, David, for sharing your research and knowledge with us this morning.